Great. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy, who in January 2022 joined Bristol University as a lecturer in the History of Art department. In 2018, Zehra co-curated the Progressive Revolution: Modern Art for a New India at New York's Asia Society Museum. The show gave rise to a desire to explore the intersections between arts, post-colony and nationalism further, resulting in a number of curatorial projects around this theme. She's currently a curatorial research fellow funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art at the Glenvivian Art Gallery in Swansea. And as part of this fellowship, she's currently co-curating with the Glenvivians' Katie Freer, Imperial Subjects, Post-Colonial Conversations between South Asia and Britain. Scheduled for December 2022. Is that still right? December 2022?
No, now it's happening in 2023. We've given ourselves it's COVID, you know.
It's the post-COVID world. Yeah, I thought I'd best check. Now scheduled for 2023, the exhibition will incorporate both historical and contemporary art from South Asia and Britain, paying a special attention to Wales. I'm really happy to have Zehra here, and today she's going to be speaking on heights in hubris, scaling mountains and macho nationalism. So over to Zehra.
Thank you so much for the invite and for being also so patient with me, chopping and changing dates and things. I have to admit that, you know, given the fact that I've sort of just started a new job and have been struggling with it a little bit, setting in, this paper is somewhat speculative, so please forgive that. It's also you know, dealing with ideas that I've been thinking through, and if people after the talk have comments and things they would like to add, and that would be really, really helpful for me, because it is very much a kind of a sort of work in progress, as you will see. A part of what I'm really, really interested in is ideas of national identity, as Samuel said, but also the way in which that national identity is developed in cultural spaces. And specifically here today, I'm looking at the way in which mountains have been sort of jettisoned into a particular idea of militaristic nationalism. And while I'm starting with India as a case study, and sort of taking you through some of the things that have been said about mountainous terrain, the idea of the sublime, and their sort of tendency towards fascistic interpretations of militaristic nationalism. You know, while that's my starting point, my ending point is looking at how we can look at the same sort of scenery in a very different vein, in a softer vein, without it necessarily becoming kind of macho nationalism. So, as the abstract said, paintings of mountain scenery are often identified with the search for the sublime. These aesthetic quests, however, are invariably enmeshed with political agendas, and here you have a deliberately provocative image of Putin standing on his mountain. In the early years of India's straining for self-rule, painters by Abanindranath Tagore were inspired by the peerless peaks of the Himalayas, a fascination he shared with Japanese pedagogue Okakura Tenshin. They gave rise to a pan-Asian style of painting that harked back to the shared Buddhist past of the region, and of course centered around ideas of the Himalayas as a connector for Buddhism in the sort of ancient Vedic rites. For instance, in watercolors like Tagore's The Asoka Legend, which I will show you, a mist-shrouded figure, perhaps the Buddhist emperor himself, dreams of a snowy peaks. Suffused with a pale golden glow, the form seems to merge with the landscape. Suggestive of spiritual enlightenment, it harks back to the golden age of India's Hindu-Buddhist or Vedic history. Such paintings came to be seen as cornerstones of the nationalist agenda on the rise in 20th century India and Japan. More recently, they have been much criticized for harboring a purist, primordial view of identity, lambasted for their supposed complicity with exclusionary ethnic nationalist agendas, and I will show you why that might be so, and you can make up your own mind. For instance, the Indian art historian Tagore speaks skeptically of the Hindu core at the center of Tagore's work, while Alistair Wright calls for a more hybrid, less essentialist approach to identity. Do such criticisms hold water? This paper will examine Tagore's Alpine paintings in the light of them. It will also touch, relatedly, on Welsh nationalism's fascination with mountains, for instance, the craggy peaks of painter John Cuffin Williams. Do such depictions leave room for a more plural nationalism than their critics would have us believe? Or is there really a perilous proximity between sublime heights and exclusivist dreams of nationalist machismo? And I hope to show you it's not an inevitable connection. Also in the case of Wales and views of mountains, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a show that I'm working on with the Glenvivian team, Katie Freer, Gemma, and Ellie Dawkins, called Art and Industry, where we're also revisiting sort of Welsh mountain landscape paintings, but from the perspective of industry. So a very, very different kind of take, not sort of sublime, peerless peaks in exactly the same way. Okay, so this is some of the shared territory that I'm going to be exploring. Lest you think that this is a very sort of specious connection between India and Wales. So here we have patriotism and the love of mountains. There's another connection between Wales and India, nationalism and its cultural imagination. A shared interest in the Asian past, a supposedly unbroken link to the annals of time and the dawn of civilization that helps imagine a nation into being. What am I talking about? Landscapes and mountains, of course. The British Labour Party politician, Aaron Bevan, who I'm sure I pronounced wrong, was born into a working class family in South Wales. He was the son of a coal miner, and most of us know him as the chief architect of the NHS. So that's quite a good way to begin. He was also rather taken with the mountains of South Wales, such as the Brecon Beacons. So to quote the sort of Swansea University's Professor Daniel Williams' article on Bevan, he says, Bevan himself was in India in March 1953, and he developed a friendship with the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and you can see them here, that was to last until the end of his life. During his first visit to India, Bevan asked to be taken to see the Himalayas. He noted that as the peaks of the Himalayas unfolded their chaste loveliness before us, I was almost seduced from my allegiance to my favorite view of the Black Mountains and the Brecon Beacons. And here you can see it. So I'm just sort of setting it up as a bit of shared territory that, you know, the attachment of both Indian and Welsh figures, political figures, to the idea of mountains somehow being part of a very important, deep national past is something that is shared territory. And this is part of how I'm weaving in why what we're looking at in an Indian context might be of relevance to a Welsh one. Despite the fact that I'm not saying that anybody here is a Hindu fundamentalist nationalist. So this is a Richard Wilson work, Snowden from late, okay, I can't do that. Cuffin Williams, the same sort of Snowden view, and certain things from Wales Online, which once in a while gives you quite interesting sort of looks, whether or not they intend to, but this is quite a good article. And it talks about the Welsh, a historian, Sir John Lloyd, argued that argued that the fastness of Eyre have at every period played a crucial part in the history of Wales, offering a refuge and retreat to discomfited peoples and providing an ideal theatre for national resistance of invasion. It is no accident that it was in Gwynedd that the tradition of independent Welsh statehood lasted longest, nor that it is in the same area that both the speaking of Welsh and the support for Welsh nationalist politics have been consistently the strongest. So Snowdon may never have enjoyed the vote, says this article, but its slopes have occasionally been courted by politicians. Most famously in 1892, a four-time Prime Minister Gladstone ascended the southern flank of the mountain as far as the large boulder, where he addressed a very large crowd on the land question in Wales. He was 83 at the time, and hanging on his every word was David Lloyd George, who would become Prime Minister himself a quarter of a century later. So again, the sort of connection between ideas of an ancient landscape, mountains, and in this case, the sort of mountains as a sort of bastion of resistance, that I kind of just want to underscore that as a sort of dialogue before we go off and look at the Himalayas. Sorry, I don't know if I can't see Samuel anymore, and I don't know if I've fallen off the radar.
I'm here. Yeah, we can see you. We can see the Kashmiri Hills and the Himalayas.
The Kashmiri Hills and the Himalayas. So yes, so these are the peerless peaks that are arriving now into our dialogue. And just to give you the sort of map of this area, but also connect you to exactly where the historic links of this dialogue actually lie, which is, if we're talking about the Himalayas and we're talking about Kashmir, we're also referencing in some ways this ancient past that was connected via the Silk Route, for which Kashmir and hence the Himalayas were a nodal point on the Silk Route. So this is also where the spread of Buddhism happens. This is where Indian liberals and artists sort of really anchor their idea of India as a plural land, of a syncretic land, as multicultural, as sort of a Kashmir as a symbol of both Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sufi, mystical belief systems, rooted in its kind of history as a nodal point on the connective Silk Road. But it also makes it very, very pivotal to all kinds of nationalist and kind of strategic ideas about a territory and conquest, just because of where it's situated, and so what makes it the great connector is also the very thing that makes it consistently be claimed by the powers that be, whoever the powers are at that particular time. So this is a map of the ancient Silk Route that passed through Kashmir, just to show you, locate the Himalayas and the mountains that we're going to be talking about. And also to give you a little bit of the sort of Islamic context of it. So as you might know, Kashmir at the moment is a battleground between India and Pakistan, has been since 1947, and the independence of India and Pakistan from British rule. And that sort of battle zone was also the very same area, as I said, connected to a kind of syncretic past that the Mughal, who are sort of Muslim emperors, also saw as their sort of paradisical garden. And so, this is a quote from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir on Kashmir, saying, "If there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this," quoting the verse of Amir Khusro, who is a sort of Sufi poet. So one of the things to remember about the Himalayas and Kashmir is that, of course, it's a Muslim majority region, and this is also the context of what I'm going to be telling you next. So this is the disputed area of Kashmir. So moving away from mountains and kind of dreaming about them is Jammu and Kashmir, a disputed area that, as you can see, backs into China, fought over by India and Pakistan. It is also an area that has recently been remilitarized, in the sense that, not that it ever was demilitarized, but it's worse than ever before, because the Indian army has, thanks to Prime Minister Modi, moved in very strongly. And we'll be talking about some of that and the mountainous musings that went along with it. So here is Modi. And this is Modi sort of doing his monk act. Modi is Prime Minister of India at the moment. This is his sort of second election as Prime Minister. He's a figure that comes to power as a part of the Hindu nationalist agenda, which is very strongly anti-Muslim. It sort of connects itself to ideas of Hindu Rashtra, i.e. Hindu nation. So calling for the idea of India equals Hindu, which means eradicating a Muslim past. And of course, one of the regions that come under this kind of eradication is naturally, as a predominantly Muslim area, also an area that was so symbolic both for the liberals who see it as syncretic and for the Mughals. Is naturally Kashmir. And so already, as you can see, these mountainous musings have a political symbolism behind them. Just seeing Modi sitting there as a monk figure, referencing in saffron. They are often known as the Saffron Brigade by the liberals in India, who are rather scared of their politics that go with saffronization, i.e. Hinduization. And so it's quite a dog whistle of an image. It's also an image that I gleaned from a newspaper clipping of Modi just before he wins his second election in 2018. And how does he win it? So everybody at this point is saying that popularity is slipping. There's a chance that he might not come in again as Prime Minister. And then, of course, you have images of Modi proclaiming his sort of connection with monkhood, dreaming of the Himalayas. And very shortly, I think, either before or after that, the Himalayas and their sort of political implications in terms of violent warfare are revealed. And this is when he sends the army into Kashmir and it goes under lockdown. And this is sort of simultaneously with him coming in with a thumping majority the second time round. So mountains definitely have a political context. Some of the things that I would like to say about mountains and mountain paintings is that it is certainly true that they have had a very bad press, right? So today I would like to analyze the roots of such mountainous Himalayan dreaming, which, tangled up with ideas of the terror sublime and tied to nationalistic fantasies, has often had a bad press. In Bavaria, Hitler harnessed the spirit of the Alps, calling up images of Aryan conquest, a swastika of power. Hitler, some very beautiful books have been written on this, based some of his strange fantasies on the sublime, imaginings of Ludwig of Bavaria's fascination with fairy walks, the music of Wagner, and the pure alpine peaks. So you also have a sort of a dialogue, building up in Germany, then associated with the sublime and this kind of mountain musing, with potentially far right nationalism, and a sort of a tainting of the sublime and the birth of the sort of Übermensch connected to Hitler and as a genius figure who conquers the Alps. And here a few sort of Hitlerian Nazi putting up the flag on Everest. And here's a little poem I found as well that makes these sort of linkages. Now, I'm not arguing for this, okay? I'm just saying that this linkage has been made, which is why the sublime and which is why mountainous musings like this have often had been treated with suspicion. And this is exactly the legacy, I would argue, that a Modi harnesses. My point is that we don't necessarily have to embrace this legacy just because we're musing about the Alps or the Himalayas. But let's see where this goes. 4 days were enough to turn the simple mountaineer Henry Kerr into a hero. He and 3 fellow climbers were the first to successfully scale the infamous North Face. Route to the summit, peak in the Swiss Alps. German-Austrian team's success was hailed as a concept of the last great problem in the Alps. It was this triumph of man over nature that the National Socialists ruling Germany and Austria at the time knew to use well for propaganda, said Friedrich Kaiser, head of an exhibition at the German Alpine Association Museum in Munich. The exhibit, titled Berg Hail, examines the group history under the Nazi regime and before. Okay, so east of the Himalayas to the Alps of Tibet. And this is Japanese alpine news. And now I'm kind of making my argument in the context of where this dialogue actually goes in the context of Indian art. It's sort of development of a kind of a Himalayan aesthetic and mountain musings alongside the rise of cultural nationalism with Germany. So you have Rorik here, who sort of talks about the Himalayan mountains as the Mount of Five Treasures, and also sort of scales them. And I'm going to go a little bit quickly here with this sort of mountainous musings. You have a particular school that comes into being called the Bengal School of Art, and particularly associated with the Tagore family. And the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, who is called Abanindranath Tagore, who spearheaded this Bengal School of Art under the mentorship of the English educator E.B. Havell. And like the Japanese, as we know, the Bengal School of Art was closely allied to the Nihinga School in Japan, thanks to the back and forth visits of Okakura Tenshin. By dreaming over the mountains, this Japanese-Indian alliance conjured a past shared, sort of shared across the Himalayas as a sort of pan-Buddhist Vedic past. And here is a sort of Tagorean fascination with this region, and I'll show you how it sort of flows into a Japanese one as well. And there's a reason for this particular connection that I'm making. So here you have Abanindranath Tagore with his work, The Asoka Legend, and here you have Ashoka, who is the Buddhist emperor of the Mauryan Empire, again sort of dreaming over the Himalayas. And the idea behind this also is, you know, the connection of these peaks with the Himalayas with a kind of Vedic Buddhist past is rather important, because it's a past that long predates the arrival of Islam or any kind of Islamic influence in the region. So it's sort of drawing on a sense of identity that it is one that is pre-Islamic, and hence what I'm arguing is that there's a possibility that this kind of dreaming is making is drawing on a past that is deliberately divisive. whether or not Tagore meant it in this way, and as I'll show you, I don't think he did mean it in this way, but it is certainly one that you could be forgiven looking at an image like this out of context of making that sort of connection between Ashoka Buddhism, the spread of Buddhism, and a Vedic past, which of course has connotations of pre-Muslim Saffron. Ashoka, who by the white stuck of his fame made spotless the universe, this kind of thing. This is Taikan, the Japanese artist who comes to visit and is also seminal in the creation of the Bengal School of Art and its equivalents to the Nihonga Japanese style painting. And he also is obsessed with these ideas of mountains. This is the holy peaks of Chichibu at spring dawn. And here I kind of want to stress that all of these mountainous musings, at least for the Japanese, right, finally this very same movement of Taikan, when they return to Japan, it sort of gets coalesced around the image of Mount Fuji, the land of the rising sun, and it sort of gets turned into a rather militaristic movement, which connects these ideas of a Vedic past, of a Buddhist past that is pan-Asian, and somehow gives the Japanese a legitimacy to be the arbitrators as the true Buddhists, to have purchase on this idea that they have a right to be pan-Asian, but also they have a right to create Asia is one by force. And a lot of these sort of paintings, especially by Taikan, get used within this very militaristic imagery as Japan moves into a more militant nationalism. So it starts with a rather soft idea of pan-Asian anti-colonial nationalism. Let's look at our past, the spiritual past, the things we share, and it moves, it slowly moves in the 40s to this kind of symbolism, which is very pretty and it looks very harmless, but it also gives rise to that particular idea of the land of the rising sun, which is a militaristic land. Okay, so here's a sort of segue then into the way in which this kind of musing can be picked up by another kind of militarism. And here you have, see this image, and then go back to this image. You can see what the sort of linkage is here. So initially we are told, and this is particularly during the campaign for the second election, and more or less simultaneous with his, militaristically going into Kashmir, right? With this kind of image presented in newspapers, dreaming. Initially, Modi wanted to settle down as a monk in the Ramakrishna mission and didn't want to join politics, we are told. Moreover, his love for spirituality was so great that as a teenager, he ran away from home and spent 2 years in the Himalayas with yogic sadhus and studied Hindutva, i.e. Hindutva is not innocent Hinduism, it is Hindu nationalism. Then he dreamt of joining the Indian Army. So here you have a little tourist brochure that also talks in exactly this kind of vein. I'm not saying that any talk of sort of spiritualism, mountains and the Himalayas, and its connections with Buddhism and ancient Hinduism needs to be militaristic. I'm just saying that it's quite interesting that militaristic nationalism has been so obsessed with these kinds of peaks, and it sort of systematically chooses the kind of language of a spiritualism of these peaks to make a certain connection between a cultural nationalism that then it twists into a militaristic dialogue through a very clever use of image making like this. So here's a little tourist brochure that is also peddling this idea of the Himalayas as a guardian of the Vedas and Vedic knowledge. It is said that the sacred river Ganga that flows through India tumbles down from the heavens to the earth, falling first into the head of god Shiva to soften the impact. In this legend, the mountains of the Himalayas are Shiva personified. So what does it mean then if the mountains of the Himalayas are Shiva personified? Is that not a justification for someone like Modi, who proclaims himself a Vedic hero, right, a warrior for Ram, a monk, spiritual figure, dreaming over this land and the Himalayas and Kashmir? So does it not in some way justify his dialogue that all he's really doing, if it's Shiva personified, is reclaiming what is already his, India's, deep India's? And so just to point out to you that, you know, it's not perfectly, it's a tenet of nationalism. It's the way nationalism develops, that it has this idea of the eternal nation. And these kind of mountain musings really lend themselves to that idea of the nation as eternal. It's time immemorial, a Vedic past, a romantic past, that somehow is spiritual and suddenly is militaristic. So here's my little bit that I want to pay attention with Benedict Anderson, whose imagined communities says, as we shall see, few things are better suited to this end than the idea of nation. If nation states are widely considered to be new and historical, the nations to which they give political expression always loom out of an immemorial past, and still more important, glide into a limitless future. It is the magic of nationalism to turn chance into destiny. With Debray, we might say, yes, it is quite accidental that I am born French, but after all, France is eternal. Ditto India. Possibly Modi. Did you know that and again, this is News 24 online that picks up on exactly this kind of image at exactly the same time Modi winning his election, invading Kashmir. Do you know PM Modi, we're reminded, wanted to be a monk and lived in the Himalayas for 2 months. So this is to return back to the question of the Tagores, the dreaming over mountains, and the reason that I've sort of made this link with the Tagores and Japan and its sort of increasing sort of militarism in the 40s, in the late 30s and 40s, under the guise of pan-Asian dreamings over mountains. So this is Abanindranath Tagore, and this is an image that he became very, very famous for, called Mother India. She's wearing saffron. And here I just want to show you is a sort of a Hindu right image of a Mother India standing with her lion, taking over the entire area, including areas of saffronization, including you have here Pakistan, Kashmir. The entire area is claimed by this Mother India, right? The saffron Mother India of Hindutva, arguably. And because of this kind of association, plus the sort of mountains and the Vedic past, etc., Abanindranath Tagore has over the years come under quite a lot of fire. So one of the things that is said about him, and as I mentioned, even the Indian art historian Tapati Guha talks about, who is very she loves his work, but she has a slight uneasiness about his Hindu core, right? And then here you have Simone Weil, who writes the modern art in Pakistan, and she has a similar kind of narrative that is happening with Tagore. And she says the pluralistic situation of the Bengal Renaissance, the gathering of intellectual, political and cultural forces, must be seen as part of a larger independent movement and the rise of national and cultural self-definition. This in turn, she says, brought with it a rejection of Western aesthetics and modernism. So far we followed that with the Tagores and pan-Asianism. But it also fostered a Hindu nationalism, and in response to that, a Muslim cultural consciousness. under this position of political influence on art and a nostalgia for the past in Bengal, dreaming of the mountains, for instance, artists in India were late to respond to modernism. Okay, none of this I agree with, but she carries on in this vein. And so just to tell you that the Bengal school, Tagore in particular, blamed for his Hindu core, blamed for this particular idea of a nostalgia for the past that fostered a Hindu nationalism, right? And according to Simon Veal, what happens in reaction to this is that the Muslim artist Chugtai is all about reviving the Mughal past as a cultural position that he adopts, as opposed to a nascent Hindu and national art promoted by the Bengal school. Now, this is where the dialogue sort of falls down for me, because I really do not think that this dreaming of the Himalayas that Tagore does is a Vedic dreaming that has a Hindu core which cancels out the Muslim past, because you also have images like this that are simultaneously produced with a Mother India, that in fact later Night at the Shalimar Bagh, again you have this whole Mughal emperor, Muslim Mughal emperor Shah Jahan dreaming over the Himalayas and Kashmir, but it's a Muslim context. So I would argue that far from using the Himalayas as in the Modi vein of creating a deep past for India that is Vedic and that removes the Muslims from Kashmir and that region completely, that in fact Tagore's vision is a very hybrid one. But I also want to point out to you how easy it is for someone like a Modi to have played with this kind of visual iconography, which is so much in the consciousness of using these images then to make his argument that is not about syncretism, that is not about the syncretic past of Kashmir or the Himalayas or this area that is a region of connectivity, but to make exactly the opposite dialogue. So here's where it's a sort of my little end game of saying, no, all mountainous musings do not need to, there is not an inevitability that they are about hyper-nationalist, exclusionary, ethnic nationalist dialogues. However, there is a connection in the way in which that imagery has been used, particularly in India today, and it's good to be aware of the context of where it's coming from. So this kind of takes me a little bit back to looking at the connections, shared territory of India and Wales, and the way in which sort of mountain musings have been also very important for a Welsh nationalist dialogue. Of course, there's no such thing as sort of a militaristic Welsh dialogue. That's really not what I'm saying. What I'm arguing is that there is a sort of cultural nationalist a spirit that also is rather attached to mountains. And so I'm going to sort of speed up on this, which I actually wish I didn't have to. I've just sort of time-wise, I think sort of taken a while to get where I was going with the Indian stuff. But just to sort of make the connection again with visual picture and its rootedness with ideas of mountains. And here you have a Richard Wilson that is often sort of used with notions of the rugged landscape and a particular kind of sublime in North Wales. And here you have the Tate website talking about the discovery of such rugged and uncultivated scenery was greatly stimulated by the taste for the sublime. And again, sort of in a more popular blog, I do love this blog by Andrew Green, and again the sort of presentation of Richard Wilson, sort of when he talks about British landscapes or presents when he talks about Welsh landscapes and mountains. Presenting them in a way that is a much more rugged than a sort of a Greco-Roman tradition with which he was initially working. And so again, the connection with the sublime and these sort of mountain musings. And here is really the crux of what I was looking at in making this connection between India and Wales, and the connection of sort of mountains and how they cement a particular kind of cultural nationalism. One thing I do want to foreground is the idea that perhaps with post-colonial nations, and it's possible that we can consider Wales as one as well. Contentious dialogue, I know. You have a sense of, as Partha Chatterjee talks about, the rise of nationalism not being through the state, through the taking over of systems of power that are state-oriented, but in post-colonial nations. So in India, initially when it was sort of rising up against the British, with the Japanese, for instance, and creating that dialogue, cultural nationalism is just as political, because it's the place where national identity can express itself, since the engines of the state in a colonial setup are not there as expressions. And so hence the connection that I'm making between India and Wales in that sense is that if you think about Wales potentially as a post-colonial nation with regard to England, then you are also talking about the rise of a cultural nationalism that is very rooted in imagining Wales through visual culture. And this is what Peter Lord has to say about Welsh mountains. And specifically, he's talking about Thomas Jones, who is the pupil of Richard Wilson. And he says, Jones had not yet visited Snowdonia, although he had ventured to London to inspect Stonehenge, which was regarded as a druidical monument, and which in his picture was transposed to the mountains of Gwynedd. By this time, the association of the Welsh mountains with liberty was firmly established, and the importance of the image to the patriotic pride of Welsh intellectuals, cultural nationalism possibly, is clear. In 1771, the satirist Evan Lloyd, who was among Jones's acquaintances in London, wrote to the leading English radical John Wilkes from his home, which looked out onto the barren mountains. If Milton was right when he called liberty a mountain nymph, I am now writing to you from her residence, and the peaks of our Welsh Alps. Telling, right? Welsh Alps heighten the idea by wearing the clouds of heaven like a cap of liberty. Okay, so what we are doing at Glenvivian is, revisiting some of this territory with our sort of art and industry exhibition, in the sense that we are revisiting some of this landscape territory. But what we're doing is that we're looking at ideas of Welshness which are not tied to this idea of like a deep past, either the sublime, a rugged Wales that is somehow wild and sort of untouched by the hand of man, or that is picturesque and rural and a different kind of untouched. What we're looking at is we're sort of taking similar sort of physical territory, and we're saying, actually, you can look at the same things, but you can actually see evidence of industry. And this gives you a completely different idea of landscape, but also potentially a very different kind of construction of the nation. And so this is sort of my ending bit that I wanted to sort of discuss. And here is a Thomas Wansley landscape from the Glenvivian Art Gallery, and it's called View of the Copperworks. And the reason that I've included it is that despite its title, this really doesn't look like it's an industry painting at all, which is partly the point that I'm making, is that it's very easy in our sort of connection of Wales with mountains, with the rural, with sort of wild and untrammeled ancient land, to completely leave out the other side of the dialogue of industrial Wales, of what else was happening in the 19th century, and the fact that, Cuffin Williams's mountains also talk about slate quarries. For instance, here is Cuffin Williams's very little seen slate sculpture. Okay, so just because dreams of mountains are not necessarily attached to fascist fantasies does not mean they are the only way to explore national identity. It could be argued that their association with ideas of a deep and ancient past, and with an eternal Wales in this case, of bardic poets in time immemorial, has negative consequences for other reasons too. The imagining of Wales as a symbol of an ancient Britain, a buttress to English patriotism's deep Celtic past and magic mountains, or its dark mirror image, the idea of Wales itself is only the space for myth, backward, wild, or picturesquely rural. These two are sort of reasons to move away from this kind of mountainous musing. According to Peter Lord's book, Industrial Society, the Visual Culture of Wales, there has been a paucity of scholarship on the way landscape and industry converged in Welsh art. He argues that this lack of attention could be explained by the fact that 19th century industrialists want to forget the source of their riches, and seeking to assimilate with the landed gentry instead, and hence the sort of work that we saw was that kind of, Richard Wilson onwards being patronized. Perhaps this explains why the Welsh landscapes that have occupied the limelight are those which celebrate a rustic Wales. Think of the much lauded paintings of Richard Wilson, steeped in pastoral preoccupations of sheep and shepherds in some cases, but in other cases of wild Wales. Or J.M.W. Turner's glowing evocations of the soaring peaks of Snowdonia, untouched by the hand of man, untroubled by modernity. Even Cuffin Williams' famous depictions of the craggy peaks are invariably fated for their portrayal of the wildness of North Wales rather than their allusion to the jagged slate quarries. This preoccupation with the pastoral has led to the perpetuation of prejudices about Wales as beautiful and undomesticated and backward. However, as the exhibition we are planning at the Glenvivian demonstrates, nothing could be further from the truth. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Wales had morphed from an agricultural land to one of Britain's foremost industrial centres. It boasted ports and railways which were pivoted for transporting coal, slate, copper and iron worldwide. The artworks in the show document the realities of this industrial revolution. After all, Welsh industry did feature in the work of many an artist. And it's about time we acknowledge this relationship. So even mountainous musings can be turned in a different direction. And that's it.